Lena stood at the edge of a garden not yet her own. The soil was soft beneath her sandals, and the breeze tugged gently at the hem of her dress. A nearby tree, still bare from winter's grip, had just begun to bud. Its branches held promise, not proof, not certainty, just the quiet suggestion that something was coming alive again. She breathed in deeply, holding it for a moment, as if she could absorb the softness of the season itself. This was her first spring in a long time that felt like hers. Not something borrowed, not something missed in a blur of obligation, but a moment of beginning. A true beginning. Lena had not always been gentle with herself. For years, she'd rushed from one expectation to the next, filling notebooks with goals, lists, and plans, only to abandon them halfway through when life demanded something louder. But something shifted after the last winter. There had been silence, longer than she expected. Silence that made her uncomfortable at first. Then curious. And then strangely welcome. It was in that silence she realized she'd never learned how to rest without guilt. The garden plot before her didn't care about that. It didn't care what she had failed to finish. It didn't care that she still didn't know where she was going. All it required was her presence. A small act of showing up. Hands in soil. Water poured without rush. Trust that roots would find their way. She crouched beside the empty bed and pressed her fingers into the earth. It was cool, damp, and forgiving. Not every seed grows. She knew that now. But planting is still an act of hope. The sky above her was soft and cloudless. A few birds called out, then quieted again, as if giving her space. There was no grand revelation, no fireworks of self-discovery. Just this, the steady beat of her heart, and the sound of her breath, and the whisper of spring beginning again. It was enough. Lena tilted her face toward the sky and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about who she used to be. She wasn't measuring progress or making herself small to be more acceptable. She was just here, alive. And that was more than enough to begin again. Lena noticed it most in the way the light spilled across her wooden floor at dusk, lingering like an old friend who had decided to stay just a bit longer. The windows stayed open more often. The breeze no longer carried the edge of winter, but something sweeter, the soft hush of growing things. Inside, her home still carried remnants of an older season. Blankets tucked over chairs. Unread books stacked on tables. A coat by the door, unused but not yet put away. She wasn't in a rush to clear it all. Some parts of her life needed to stay, even if the season had changed. She'd learned, quietly and without ceremony, that healing doesn't arrive in a single wave. It drips in slowly, like melted frost, seeping into the corners of your life until you notice that the air feels different and you no longer hold your breath in the same way. The plant by her windowsill, a gift she once almost forgot to water, had sprouted 2 new leaves. Lena touched them gently, marveling at how something so quiet could still be so alive. Some mornings, she still woke with the weight of the past resting on her chest. But it was lighter now, less demanding. And when it came, she didn't resist it. She sat with it, made it tea, let it speak, then gently let it leave. That, too, was a kind of progress. On this particular morning, Lena walked the garden path barefoot. The grass, still damp with dew, pressed softly between her toes. She wore a light shawl, not for the cold, but for comfort, a reminder that softness could be chosen, even on days that didn't ask for it. She paused at the fence line and watched the sunrise pull gold across the sky. There was no rush to begin the day. No pressure to make something big happen. Her only task, as she saw it, was to let the light in. And so she did. She stood still, breathing, holding the warm cup in her hands. Her thoughts didn't chase anything. They just moved like clouds, shifting shapes without urgency. For so long, she had associated growth with motion, with ambition, with effort. But now, standing barefoot in her own stillness, she realized that some of the most important changes happen while standing still. Letting go, letting in, letting be. This was spring, too. The quiet, the breath, the not quite knowing. She took one more sip from her cup and whispered, almost to herself, I am still becoming. Spring, like healing, doesn't shout its arrival. It slips into your life through small, almost invisible shifts. The change in the air. The way birdsong becomes more insistent. How light bends through the kitchen window just a little differently than it did the week before. She noticed it in herself, too. There were days she laughed, really laughed, and it caught her off guard. The sound felt new. Not borrowed from someone else's joy or forced to make others comfortable, but her own. Honest and unplanned. She didn't mark it on a calendar or journal it that night. Instead, she let the feeling rise and fall like breath. She knew by now that not everything needed to be captured to be remembered. One afternoon, Lena walked to the market for fresh herbs. It was something small, something she would have skipped before. But she'd begun to find comfort in the rituals of everyday life. Rinsing greens, warming bread, hearing the kettle click off. None of it was dramatic, and that's what made it beautiful. Quiet things didn't need applause to matter. The vendor at the herb stall smiled and said, You look like spring today. She hadn't known what she looked like, but those words clung to her gently, like light fabric in the breeze. Back at home, she opened her window and let the wind stir the curtains. Her plant, the one on the sill, had grown again. Another leaf. A small one, tender and pale green, reaching toward the sun. She sat beside it with a notebook in her lap and just listened. Not to music. Not to podcasts. Just to life. The rustle of branches. A neighbor's footsteps on the gravel. Her own heartbeat, steady and present. In that moment, Lena knew she was healing. Not because everything was fixed, but because she no longer felt the need to rush toward a version of herself she hadn't yet met. She was here. And here was good. Spring, she realized, is not about being new. It's about returning to the parts of yourself you forgot during the colder seasons. It's about softening again. Letting yourself be gentle. Letting yourself be whole. And when she placed her pen to the page and wrote only one sentence, I am learning to trust the quiet. She didn't need anything more. The breeze kept blowing. The tea stayed warm. And somewhere in the sky, a bird sang without needing an audience. The sun had shifted. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you feel before you see. The way warmth begins to sink deeper into your skin. The way the air thickens slightly with promise. The way people linger outside just a little longer, talking slowly, savoring the hours as if they know daylight is a gift. Elias noticed it most in the mornings. The light came earlier, waking him before the alarm ever could. And he let it. He no longer rushed. Not in summer. This was the season he loved best, the time when things bloomed fully, without apology. When fruit hung heavy on branches and laughter traveled farther than it did in the colder months. Everything felt more alive. And so did he. Elias wasn't the kind of man who needed much noise. His life had taught him to listen more than speak, to observe the world rather than demand something from it. But summer always drew something new out of him, a willingness to be seen, to step into the light rather than stay in the shade. He spent more time near the water these days. A quiet lake not far from home had become his sanctuary. Sometimes he swam. Sometimes he just sat with a sketch pad in hand, drawing whatever felt like showing up. A crooked tree, a ripple in the surface, the shape of a cloud. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be true. That was his mantra now. There had been years where everything was performance. He had worn success like armor and smiled when he was tired and said, I'm good, when he wasn't. But those years taught him something valuable, that appearing strong isn't the same as being strong. That being seen and being known are two very different things. Now he chose stillness. Not as an escape, but as a way back to himself. On one afternoon in particular, Elias sat beneath the tall grass at the lake's edge. The sun hung high, warm and bright, but not harsh. In his hands was a page nearly filled, the lines not perfect, but honest. A tree leaning into the breeze. The same breeze that brushed across his arms now. He smiled, not because something spectacular had happened, but because nothing had to. He was here. Whole. breathing, becoming. Summer, he thought, is not just a season. It's a permission slip. To live. To open. To be fully present with who you are, not someday, but now. He placed the sketchbook on the grass and let the sun fall across his face. The world was loud elsewhere. But here it was enough to be. There was something sacred about the ordinary. Elias didn't always see it. There were years he lived for the big moments, the accomplishments, the celebrations, the high notes and conversations that left everyone laughing. But now, in this season of his life, it was the quieter intervals that meant the most. He'd begun rising with the sun, not out of necessity but reverence. Each morning he made coffee slowly. He watched the steam curl up like incense and listened to the way the birds spoke before the rest of the world opened its eyes. It was never spectacular. It was never broadcast. But it was holy in its own way. One morning, he sat on the porch with a pen in his hand and no intention other than to let the words come. The page in front of him remained mostly blank, and he didn't mind. He was no longer writing for productivity. He was writing to listen. Summer had taught him that not everything beautiful needs to be completed. The garden outside had grown wild in places, not unkempt, just free. Vines climbed fences, with no regard for symmetry. Blossoms burst open in places he hadn't planted. There was beauty in that too, in the things that thrived without needing control. He thought of his younger self sometimes. The version of him that needed to prove, to push, to always be doing. That man had tried hard to earn rest, believing he needed to achieve peace rather than receive it. Now he understood. Peace is not earned. It's welcomed. He welcomed it in small ways. A slower breakfast. A walk without headphones. Letting the sun fall across his face and not checking the time. These things added up, not like tasks on a checklist, but like drops of water filling a cup. One afternoon, Elias visited a local market where children played near the fountain, their laughter echoing like music. He stood still for a moment, soaking in the noise and light and color, not clinging to any of it, just witnessing. And in witnessing, he felt connected. Not in the way social media told him he should feel, but in the quiet way presence makes you feel alive. He bought a basket of peaches and carried them home like treasure. They were sun-warmed and fragrant, and when he bit into one, the juice ran down his hand. He laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes joy spills out when you stop holding everything in. That night, as the sky turned lavender and the heat began to ease, Elias sat on the porch again. The same place, the same silence. But he was not the same. He had softened, opened, lived a little more deeply in his own skin. And that, he thought, is what summer is for. Not chasing light, but letting it find you. The days began to shorten, though only by a little. Elias noticed it not with concern, but with a quiet nod of recognition. Seasons didn't ask permission to change, they simply did. And the warmth that once lingered into the evening now dipped away just a little earlier, like a familiar guest preparing to leave. But summer hadn't gone. Not yet. It lived in the golden edges of afternoon, in the laughter that still carried from neighborhood porches, in the peaches he kept on the windowsill until the last one grew too soft to hold. It lived in him too, in the space he had carved out by choosing presence over performance. One evening, he returned to the lake. It looked the same, but felt different. The water, once warmed by long days, had cooled slightly. The trees, once deep green, held the faintest touch of rust along the edges. A subtle reminder that time had kept moving, even as he stood still. He sat with that truth and did not resist it. Change no longer frightened him. He had learned to greet it the same way he greeted sunrise, with curiosity and quiet gratitude. It didn't mean the shift was always easy. It just meant it was necessary. Nearby, an older woman sat on a bench with a scarf wrapped around her shoulders. She held a journal in her lap, but wasn't writing. Just watching. Listening. Breathing. Elias wondered briefly if she, too, had learned the language of silence. Their eyes met only for a moment. No words. Just a glance of shared understanding. The kind that only comes when two people know what it means to live through seasons and still remain whole. He stood, offered her a nod, and walked along the path. Leaves crunched beneath his feet, dry and curled and beautiful in their surrender. He smiled. Even in falling, they gave something back: color, sound, rhythm. A reminder that letting go can be beautiful too. That night, Elias lit a single candle and turned the lights low. He sat by the window and watched dusk arrive slowly, stretching its arms across the horizon. The warmth of summer had softened now, but it hadn't left. It had simply moved inward, into his breath, into his bones, into the quiet moments that asked for nothing but his full attention. He closed his eyes and listened, to the wind, to the creak of the porch, to the story life tells when we finally stop interrupting. And in that stillness, he felt her coming. Autumn. Not in the form of cold or loss, but in the shape of reflection. A whisper on the wind. A shift in the soul. A season that would not ask him to forget summer, only to carry its warmth into whatever came next.
The air had changed.
It wasn't sharp yet, not the bite of winter, but crisp, like the clean edge of a page turning. May felt it first in her shoulders, in the way she instinctively reached for the soft, familiar scarf that had waited patiently at the back of her closet. She didn't mind the shift. Autumn had always felt like an old friend, the kind who speaks softly, listens closely, and doesn't mind silence. It asked nothing of her except that she notice. And she did. She noticed everything. The way the leaves surrendered so gracefully, not with drama, but with quiet brilliance. The way shadows stretched longer, pulling time out like taffy. The way the earth seemed to exhale, as if relieved to rest after a season of bursting growth. May moved slower now, but with intention. Each morning, she made tea the old-fashioned way. No machines, just a kettle, a pot, and leaves that steeped in stillness. She held the cup in both hands and sat near the window, watching the trees shed what no longer served them. There was a lesson in that. She had carried much over the years: roles, responsibilities, regrets. And yet here she was still becoming. Not despite those things, but because of them. She didn't wish to erase her past. She simply no longer wished to be ruled by it. One afternoon, May walked to the park with her journal tucked under one arm. The air was filled with the scent of turned earth and wood smoke. Children laughed in the distance, and wind danced through the amber leaves like music. She sat on a wooden bench that curved like an embrace and opened her notebook, not to write something profound, but to write honestly. She wrote, "I no longer need to prove that I've grown. I only need to live in the truth that I have." Her handwriting was slower these days, but each word felt more anchored, more intentional. She smiled at the line she'd just written and closed the book. Some things didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be felt. A breeze lifted her scarf gently. She closed her eyes and leaned into it. May had learned that some seasons are meant for gathering and others for releasing. Autumn was the great reminder that both were sacred. She didn't fear what lay ahead. She had already walked through so many versions of herself: daughter, mother, teacher, friend, and now, simply May. Enough. Always enough. The trees would be bare soon. The wind would turn colder. And the quiet would come again. But for now, she sat in the golden in-between, wrapped in warmth and wisdom, and whispered to the wind, "I am still here. And that is more than enough." The wind had settled, and the world seemed to exhale with it. May sat beneath the tallest tree in the garden near her home. It had been there longer than most things in her life, rooted deep, branches wide, leaves now falling one by one in their own quiet rhythm. She brought her journal, as always, though she wasn't sure what she'd write today. Sometimes she just sat. And that was enough. The late afternoon light filtered through the amber canopy above her. The warmth of the sun had thinned, but it was still there, clinging gently to the folds of her scarf, resting against her cheek. It reminded her of things that linger: kindness, memory, the words left unspoken that still somehow echo. She didn't know what made her reach for the book today, the old one, the one she had kept since she was a young woman. A novel worn by time, its pages soft, corners folded, the spine cracked in a dozen places. It wasn't the story that called her this time. It was the memory of reading it under this very tree, decades ago, when the world still felt large and wild and full of questions she hadn't yet answered. She smiled softly, not in sadness, but in gratitude for how far she had come, and how tender it had all been. She ran her fingers along a familiar line and closed the book gently, holding it in her lap as the wind stirred the leaves again. It occurred to her then that the seasons were not simply something she had lived through, they were something she had become. There was the hopefulness of Lena's spring, blooming again after silence. The fullness of Elias's summer, when joy was not loud but alive. The wisdom of her own autumn, the art of letting go without losing love. Each season lived in her now. She looked out across the field, where the last few sunbeams stretched like long, golden fingers. The world didn't rush.
And neither did she.
She had learned the beauty of moving at the pace of her own breath. She gathered her things slowly.
The book.
The journal. A few leaves that had fallen into her lap. She tucked them into her pocket without thought, little reminders that nothing is ever truly gone, only transformed. Before standing, she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing stillness to settle one last time. And then she whispered gently to the wind, as if it might carry her words to whoever needed them most. If you are still becoming, you are right on time. As May disappeared into the light, we gently closed this chapter, not with an ending, but with a breath. You've just taken a quiet walk through the seasons, through spring's beginnings, summer's depth, autumn's reflection. Maybe you saw yourself in Lena, or in Elias, or maybe May reminded you of a version of yourself still becoming. Before you go, I'd love to ask, what is your favorite season and why? Is it the renewal of spring, the joy of summer, the wisdom of autumn, or the stillness of winter yet to come? Let me know in the comments. Your reflection may be the words someone else needs to read. And if this journey touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It helps this story find others who need it, those quietly healing in their own season of life. Thank you for being here. Thank you for walking slowly with me. And most of all, thank you for listening. You are not alone. You never were. And you are always becoming.